Hey, good afternoon. It's Monday, July 8th, and welcome back to Everyday Talk 24/7 as we start another week together. We ended last week with looking at grief and how we can find comfort in grief. And we look at that very familiar passage at the end of 2 Corinthians 4, where Paul says, "Outwardly we're wasting away, but inwardly we're being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that outweighs them all." So I started there, but now I want to go back and look a little bit earlier in the chapter. How does Paul arrive at this stunning conclusion that he's not blown away by the light and momentary troubles, the things that crush us? Well, we'll look at verses 7 through 12 tonight of 2 Corinthians 4. And this explains how we know grief, but we're not crushed by it. We know grief, but we're not crushed by it. Here's what Paul says. "But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show the all-surpassing power." This all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. "We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed." And grieving is part of being hard-pressed, pressed down. We are hard-pressed. We're grieving. "Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may be revealed in our mortal bodies. So then, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you." I can't unpack all of this, but let's look at it as it pertains to grief. I hear some cows in the background. They're wandering very close tonight. Paul starts as we have this treasure, this glorious gospel, this truth of God that's been revealed to them. And it's in these jars of clay, and that means vessels of clay that aren't very sturdy, that can be easily broken. And he's speaking as a leader. We're going to come back to that, but that's how he starts. So we don't get blown away by all the extra, "I'm great, look at all the great stuff I have, look at all I've accomplished." But he's focusing on this treasure in jars of clay. Then he says, "We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed." See, Paul is telling us here that this being hard pressed, grief is a part of life. We don't need to run from it. We can embrace it and accept it because it identifies us with Christ. And then he reveals something here I think is pretty fascinating about leaders and people who would lead God's people, people who want to be leaders in the church. Very interesting point here. Listen to what he says. "We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus might be revealed in our body." See, what's happening to him? He's speaking as an apostle, as a leader in the church. He's hard-pressed, but not crushed. He's perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. That's a testimony of a faithful leader in Christ. Someone who is a leader is not someone who has a wonderful, pleasant life. If we're going to be involved with people, it's going to hurt. It's going to cost. We're going to feel the pain. We're going to experience the difficulty. If we're going to care for people, we're going to experience that and know the hardness that's there, the difficulty that's there. A leader who is fully committed to what it means to know God is someone acquainted with grief, acquainted with hardship, and not running from it, and not telling you to get out of it, but to trust Jesus as the source. Our leaders should be aware of the difficulties of this life, to know grief, to know harassment, to know what it means to be perplexed, to be persecuted, but know that God has not abandoned them. So that's a kind of a hidden subtext right here. Let's don't miss this about our leaders. They're not people. People who are free from the difficulties of this world are not good leaders. Please listen to me on that. But then the other thing we can draw from this, Paul is knowing that God is with him. I'm hard pressed on every side, but I'm not crushed. That means I don't have to avoid or shield others from grief. We make a mistake if we try and shield our children from grief. We may not need to go on into all the details, but grief is a part of life. We need to grieve with them when they lose a pet, or something happens that's hard, or even if it's a loved one. That's what life is about. We need to be able to share with them and say, yes, I know that we're pressed down by this. I know that it's just so hard, but we're not crushed by it. God is there with us. And then finally, Paul again points to himself as a leader. And if we're going to care for people, this verse 12 is so important. He says, so then death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. See what he's saying here? He knows the difficulty of grief, the hardness of this life. And out of that experience, he knows God, knows God's faithfulness and God's care, so that he can give that to those he cares for. So the hardness, the difficulty, the grief is not wasted on Paul or the leaders of the church, but rather is to be taken and embraced so that we can give hope and life to those who are being pressed down. We can't avoid being pressed down. We can't avoid the grief, but we can avoid being crushed, because that's what our God is all about. He is our rock, our hope. That's how he can get to the point later on in the chapter where it says these things are like our light momentary afflictions, because we're not looking just at what is seen, we're looking at what is unseen. That's what's being given to us here in verses 7 through 12. Again, I love your thoughts, love your feedback. This is so important for us. Yes, we know grief, but we're not crushed. Thank you so much for being here, and Lord willing, we'll talk to you tomorrow. Have a great night.